So this past June 19th was the first Juneteenth that had been officially been ratified by the federal government as a federal holiday. So there were these Juneteenth commemorations, celebrations, festivals, etc., being held across the country, and there were a number of them in New York City. So I said, I have a feeling that there is going to be a whole lot of politicians, elected officials, other kind of government figures who try to seize on Juneteenth just to engage in electioneering. I mean, the New York City mayoral election is today, so and it's also other municipal elections in New York City today. So my sense was there were going to be, kind of electioneering activity at these Juneteenth events because politicians never let a good festival go to waste. You go to a Memorial Day parade, you go to 4th of July parades, etc. There's a good chance you're going to encounter an elected official. And journalistically, makes sense for me to be present among elected officials so I can ask them questions that they might not otherwise expect or get from other kind of more traditionally situated journalists and then relay them to the public. So I went to Jamaica, Queens, which is in Southeast Queens, for this first inaugural Juneteenth event that was held in a park. Now, there were vendors and there were food stalls and stuff, and that was all good. And I, had a smoothie and everything, so I was perfectly content with the offerings there. But it did strike me that when you went over to the stage area of this festival that had been set up professionally with all, the standard audio equipment and so on, during like kind of the main portion of the festival, the main portion of like the day-long event, where politicians and elected officials, big name officials, had shown up to speak, I have to say, I have to just be honest and confide to you that there might have been around 50 people there. And you could say to yourself, oh, I could see that being the case if, you just had like a local official or, a councilman or some other kind of obscure government agent speaking. Why would there be anybody there? Well, that wasn't the case at this event. You had Chuck Schumer there. Chuck Schumer, he's the majority leader of the United States Senate. He has more power in the federal government than virtually anybody else aside from the president. Arguably second only to the Speaker of the House, but even that's, debatable. So Chuck Schumer was there. And Chuck Schumer was speaking to a crowd of around 50 people, clad in his brand new Juneteenth stylistic t-shirt, posing around and kind of strutting and, peacocking. And hardly anybody there even knew who he was amongst the piddling few people who were even there. So he had to be followed around by like a helper holding a giant Meet Senator Chuck Schumer sign. And it wasn't just Schumer. You had Bill de Blasio there. You had members of Congress who were there, Gregory Meeks, Grace Meng. So these were some prominent figures in New York State politics. And they were speaking to a crowd of 50 people. Now, that was curious, given all the hype around Juneteenth. It was the first holiday with it kind of being federally recognized like this. So you'd think there'd be a lot of anticipation, a lot of turnout. It just was not a whole lot of turnout. And Jamaica, Queens is a predominantly non-white area. So, if the idea was to tailor this holiday to, non-whites and, blacks in particular, you think this would be an area where you could get a big turnout, but it was pretty meager, which afforded an opportunity to me anyway to interact with some of these elected officials. But anyway, so I'm watching these kind of elected officials speak, And it wasn't just Schumer and de Blasio and Meng and Meeks. There was state assemblymen, council people, etc. And one thing that struck me is that you had the MC of the event, an assemblywoman, talking about how Southeastern and Queens elected officials are so great because they collectively, in New York City elected officials collectively, are all together fighting the power. They used that phrase was used, fighting the power. And you got to think to yourself, okay, this is a Juneteenth event. Juneteenth was just recognized by the federal government, ratified unanimously by the Senate at the behest of Chuck Schumer. The Democratic Party controls overwhelmingly New York City government. It, since 2018, has totally controlled New York State government. It controls the Congress and the presidency. And yet you have these elected officials presenting themselves as though they are somehow fighting the power, even though it seemed like they're the ones who embody power. They wield state power. Yet they have this whole aesthetic of kind of like revolutionary dissent that's tied in with the whole Juneteenth ethos, but in a way is really kind of phony and cynical, because how could you be fighting the power if you are the ones who wield state power? You've been endowed with the power to run the government by the voters. And yet you can kind of adopt this persona or this kind of mystique of kind of dissension, when who should you would be the ones who would have to be fought if anybody was fighting the power. But anyway, that's kind of the cultural milieu that they try to situate themselves within, because you know what, it's a good political tack. It enables them to kind of deflect attention from the power that they do in fact wield, and kind of draw on, this kind of the cultural energy around protest and the pop cultural references of the past, like, Public Enemy did Fight the Power. And I don't know, when Public Enemy was talking about fighting power, I think they might have been talking about government officials, but fast forward like 20 or 30 years, and all of a sudden elected officials are the ones who purport to be fighting the power. And so there's a political logic there. There's like a rhetorical logic there and why they adopt that presentation for themselves. And I think it's a means by which they deflect scrutiny, really. And it's obviously most present in heavily Democratic areas, such as New York City, Southeast Queens, etc. And so this actually at least raised the question to me, because you had an elected official bloviating about how all these fellow elected officials were getting together to fight the power. And meanwhile, behind her on stage, standing triumphantly, was Chuck Schumer. The majority leader of the United States Senate is standing there proudly, kind of posing for pictures and everything else, very happy with himself. And somehow his colleagues are there saying they're going to fight the power. Like, who is the power in the context of the United States government if not Chuck Schumer? And yet he's like your associate here. So, I mean, the absurdity of that, the paradox of that should be pretty self-evident. And yet I doubt anybody would have thought to challenge or at least interrogate that paradox, if not for me being there. So what I did was, as Chuck Schumer is moseying around after giving his remarks, desperately trying to find anybody in the crowd who recognized him, which there were, almost laughably few. I went up to him and said, Senator, well, gee golly whiz, don't you think it's a bit odd for the MC of this event to be, proclaiming how elected officials are fighting the power with you on stage as the majority leader of the United States Senate? And he said something to the effect of, go to my Substack if you want the exact quote, because I have it. He said, well, we need all the help we can get, including him, him pointing upward. So he pointed to the sky. So apparently there's a higher power. So the whole issue of power dynamics has really gotten scrambled here, because Chuck Schumer was rationalizing this notion of him engaging in a fight the power crusade by referencing a higher power, meaning a divine metaphysical power, which also needs to be fought, or it needs to be brought into the fight, or who knows. Chuck Schumer was talking about fighting the fight, and what fight needs to be fought, always unclear. And it just goes to show that they have no answer. There's no kind of logical recourse to that inquiry, because it's self-evidently ridiculous to posit that Chuck Schumer could possibly be involved in fighting the power. It's an aesthetic, it's a cultural appeal, and it has a certain political resonance, and that's what I think needs to be examined more closely. And so that's what I did, and I think Chuck Schumer eventually kind of figured me out and kind of scolded me and said, no more questions. So I guess that's when you know you've journalistically accomplished something. So here's the more amusing part. I mean, that part was kind of darkly amusing. And the second part of my Juneteenth experience was also amusing. You could argue there was a dark element there as well, but okay. So just kind of ambling around this event, and the MC gets back on stage at one point and says, oh, by the way, guess what, everybody? We have Islanders tickets. So go over there if you want Islanders tickets. And there was just no reaction. Now, side note, I was essentially the only white person there at this event, which, I actually enjoy, because it puts you in a different environment. There's something kind of always interesting about that to me. So I actually like that. And so I'm walking around, right? There's no reaction to this announcement that somebody somewhere has Islanders tickets that they want to give out. It's not clear if people even are aware of what the Islanders are. Like, why would they be? Hockey is the whitest sport possibly on the face of the earth. It's filled with like Nordics and Canadians. And people from North Dakota and stuff. So I'm ambling around, and this lady approaches me and says, are you looking for the Islanders tickets? And I said, no, not really. I mean, are you offering me Islanders tickets right now? And I don't follow hockey at all. I mean, when I was a kid, I was into the New Jersey Devils because I'm from New Jersey. The New Jersey Devils were one of only two at that time national teams in the National League that were specifically from New Jersey, and then the Devils had a good run. They won the Stanley Cup in '95 and 2000, and then 2003, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a pretty successful team. But I hadn't been to a hockey game, I'm almost positive, since '95, when I was 6 years old, when I went with my dad to a playoff hockey Devils game. And I just don't follow the sport. I can follow it if I watch a game, but I just don't follow it. And so this lady comes up to me and says, are you looking for the Islanders tickets? And I thought to myself, there's probably an angle that I could take with this if I was really trying to be cynical, or I'm being racially profiled because I'm the only white guy here. And so it's assumed that I'm the only one that's going to be interested in Islanders tickets. But of course, I'm not going to do that, even though that would be sort of a funny bit, maybe. So I said to the lady, I mean, are you offering me Islanders tickets? And she said, sure. And I said, what do I need to do? Is there like a raffle? Do I need to sign up for something? Do I have to perform a skit? Something. I mean, there must be something expected of me to receive these Islanders tickets, because the Islanders are in the Stanley Cup semifinals right now, the playoffs. This would be an expensive ticket. I did actually know that much. I knew that the playoffs were underway and the Islanders were in it, because I've seen, I don't know, standings or headlines or stuff or whatever. And she said, no, just give me your phone number and your name, and you'll get the tickets over text. And I said, really? That's it? So I said, okay. So I gave her my information. And sure enough, I'm waiting to get the text. I'm not 100% sure if this is, legit or whatnot. And so I get, but sure enough, a couple hours later, I eventually do get the text. Now I get I get these tickets way too late to even like invite a friend or somebody to come along, because it's out, in Long Island, and I don't know anybody who lives in Long Island. So I just went myself, which I'm actually perfectly fine to do. So I went myself to the Nassau Coliseum. Sure enough, I'm able to get in to the stadium. I end up in my section. So I go to where my tickets say I'm sitting, and I'm the only guy in an entire section in prime seating area, 2 full rows. I'm the only guy who's been given tickets pursuant to Juneteenth outreach by the Islanders. The lady who gave me the tickets was actually an employee of the Islanders team, and they were doing Juneteenth related outreach. And so the fruits of this outreach was me. And this entire section of seating was totally vacant except for me. So I was the beneficiary of the Juneteenth outreach by the New York Islanders. And it was comical because literally for like the first period, it was just me in this section. Eventually, other people like kind of noticed that there was an entire giant section in prime seating area that was uninhabited, and they came over. There actually were 2 other guys who ended up in the section, and I asked them, like, did you get these tickets through Juneteenth outreach or something? And they said, no, they just knew somebody who knew the lady who was giving away the tickets. So literally, I was the only, a white guy was the only person who received these special Juneteenth outreach tickets from the New York Islanders. And I have to say, despite the hilarity of that being true, it was a very enjoyable game. The Islanders won in dramatic fashion, 3-2, insane ending play. But it did sort of shed some light on how these outreach initiatives don't always pay the dividends that the corporate officials in charge of such outreach hope them to.